So, what if I told you there's a movement inside American Christianity that believes God has called believers to take control of the government, the media, the schools, and even Hollywood? It sounds like a conspiracy theory, I know, but it isn't. It's called the Seven Mountains Mandate. One of the people who helped popularize this idea, evangelical speaker Lance Wallnau, once summed it up like this: whoever controls the culture shapes the future, and whoever shapes the culture ultimately governs. That statement captures the basic idea behind something called the Seven Mountains Mandate, a belief that Christians are called by God to gain influence and eventually leadership over the institutions that shape society: government, education, media, business, family, religion, and arts and entertainment. Now, if you've never heard of this before, you're not alone. Most Americans haven't. But the idea has been circulating in certain religious circles for decades, and in recent years, it has started showing up more and more in American politics. So today I want to talk about what the Seven Mountains Mandate actually is, where it came from, how it connects to politics, and why many Christians, including me, strongly oppose it. And the big question running through all of this is pretty simple. Why do some Christians believe they're supposed to take control of society's major institutions? Hello, everyone, and welcome to another supplemental installment of Back Porch Files from Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. So let's jump right into this because there's a lot to cover, especially for a supplemental episode like this. So, the Seven Mountains Mandate grew out of parts of the evangelical world of the 1970s. Two religious leaders, Lauren Cunningham and Bill Bright, both said they had similar visions about Christians influencing the major spheres of society. Over time, the concept evolved into what we now call the Seven Mountains. The teaching says society is shaped by seven major areas of cultural influence: religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And if you're thinking, okay, that sounds like a pretty sweeping idea, you're not wrong. The basic belief here is that Christians are called to rise to positions of influence within those institutions so that they can then reshape society according to quote-unquote biblical values. Now, to be fair, religious people participating in public life is not only not new, it's absolutely normal. Churches have long been involved in charity, civil rights, community activism. But the Seven Mountains Mandate goes a big step further. The idea is not simply to influence culture. The idea is to take over culture. And that's where critics begin to get uneasy, because in its stronger forms, the concept begins to resemble something called dominion theology. This is the belief that society should ultimately be governed according to biblical principles. Now, before we go any further, it's important to say something here. This is not a secret conspiracy theory. Leaders who promote the Seven Mountains Mandate talk about it very openly in books and sermons and conferences and any number of places online. They publish videos about it. They teach it at church events. This is not hidden. It's just something that most Americans have not heard about. But the real reason this idea matters isn't the theology of it. It's the politics of it. Because if you believe Christians are supposed to reclaim the mountain of government, elections suddenly become more than just political contests. They become part of some sort of spiritual mission. One of the most visible figures promoting this worldview has been Lance Wallnau. During the 2016 United States presidential election, Wallnau began arguing that Donald Trump had been chosen by God for a specific purpose. He compared Trump to the biblical figure King Cyrus. In the Bible, Cyrus was not part of the Jewish faith, but he was used by God to protect Israel. So the argument went like this. Trump might not be personally religious, might not be, but God could still be using him as a political instrument. That narrative became very influential in certain charismatic Christian circles. And I'm sure if you spend even a fraction of the amount of time on social media that I do, you've heard people say this. And it helped some religious voters to see Trump not necessarily as the morally vacant human that he is, but as a tool for restoring Christian influence in American culture. Now, around the same time, another movement began overlapping with these ideas. It's often associated with networks sometimes described as the New Apostolic Reformation. This movement emphasizes modern-day prophets who claim to receive divine guidance about political events. After the 2020 presidential election, several of these figures publicly declared that Trump would remain president. Now, not become president again, but remain president. Those predictions appeared at large prayer gatherings in Washington. One of the most well-known was something called the Jericho March. Participants prayed around government buildings, believing that God would intervene in the election results. The name comes from the biblical story, of course, where the Israelites marched around the city of Jericho until its walls collapsed. The symbolism is pretty clear. Pray enough, march enough, and the walls of the political system would come tumbling down. Now, to be clear, many of the people attending these events were peaceful demonstrators, but the rhetoric often framed the election as a spiritual battle between good and evil. And when politics gets framed in that way, or anything close to that way, compromise becomes virtually impossible. Now, there's also a political strategy element connected to this broader movement. And one example is a legislative initiative known as Project Blitz, associated with organizations like the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation. The strategy encourages lawmakers to pass legislation in stages. First come the symbolic measures, like requiring "In God We Trust" displays in public schools and the Ten Commandments in public schools. Next come broader religious freedom protections, and then eventually the focus shifts to shaping public policy around specific religious values. Now, the supporters say these efforts defend religious liberty. I say they represent a long-term effort to increase religious influence in government and, by proxy, reduce the religious freedom of other religions. But either way, the philosophy lines up closely with this Seven Mountains idea of gaining influence over society's institutions. But now here's the twist in the story. The strongest criticism of the Seven Mountains mandate isn't coming from some secular critic. It's coming from other Christians. Supporters of the idea sometimes cite biblical passages about being the salt and light of the world, or about humanity exercising dominion over the earth. But critics, like me, point to something else. They point towards the words of Christ. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus famously says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Many theologians interpret that as a clear distinction between political authority and spiritual authority. And then there's another moment in the Gospel of John where Jesus stands before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and Pilate asks if he is a king. And Jesus answers, "My kingdom is not of this world." Now, that sentence alone undermines the entire idea of establishing political power in the real world in the name of Christianity. Because the early church did not try to take control of governments. For the first 3 centuries of its existence, Christianity spread with zero political power. No armies, no legislatures, no institutions. It spread through persuasion, community, and charity. Which is why many Christian leaders warn that Christian nationalism, which is what this all boils down to, Christian nationalism, that it risks turning a faith into a political identity. Now, if all this sounds like something happening at big national rallies or megachurch conferences, there's another piece of the story. Ideas like the 7 Mountains Mandate often spread through local politics, school boards, county offices, state legislatures. If you believe culture is shaped by institutions like education and government, then local offices suddenly become very important. And across the country in recent years, we've seen a surge of activism focused specifically on school boards and local government. Sometimes it appears in curriculum debates. Sometimes it involves prayer in schools or religious displays. Sometimes it shows up in broader culture war battles about history and sexuality or what students should and shouldn't be learning. Now, not everyone involved in those debates believes in the 7 Mountains Mandate specifically, but the underlying idea that Christians should reclaim leadership in the institutions shaping culture, that lines up very closely with that worldview. Which is why movements like this often focus less on presidential elections and more on grassroots politics. Because if you want to influence culture, you don't just win the White House, you win the school board meeting on Tuesday night. Now, in the end, that's really the question here. Not whether Christians should participate in politics. Obviously they should. Absolutely they should. Religious people have every right to bring their values into public life. The real question is something bigger. What happens in a democracy when one movement believes it has a divine assignment to control the institutions of society? And more to the point, whose version of the Bible is going to be the one that's used to set all this up? Because I'll be the first one to tell you that the Bible I read and the Bible that a lot of Christian nationalists have read appear to be 2 very different books. Because once politics becomes a battle between God's will and everyone else's, compromise stops being possible. And democracy, by its very nature, is supposed to run on compromise. I know it's hard to lose that thread these days, but that's really the way it's supposed to work. And this is why understanding ideas like the 7 Mountains Mandate matters. Not because most Americans believe it, but because the ones who do are trying to reshape the system. All right, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to download and listen to this installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm extremely grateful that you do, and I would love to hear from you in any feedback that you want to give. I'd be interested in hearing. If you go to the website, www.neighborontheleft.com, you can find a contacts page with all of the social media links as well as the email address for the podcast. And you can use any of these to reach out to the podcast with your comments or questions or critiques or whatever. Also on the website is a web player where you can download or listen to streaming every episode of the podcast since its beginning. And there is also a blog section where I put blog entries that mirror the topics I talk about on the podcast, including the sources that I use. I'll be back this coming Tuesday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So from now till then, stay vigilant, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.